Thank you all for joining us for the role of women in the revival of the Irish language. We are joined tonight by Margaret Ward, Gráinne Mcneil and Linda Irvine. Margaret Ward is Honorary Senior Lecturer in History at Queen's University Belfast and a former Director of the Women's Resource and Development Agency. She is a feminist historian with a particular interest in the contribution of Irish women to political movements in the 20th century. Her latest book is Fearless Women, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Feminism and the Irish Revolution. She's also recently published a chapter on the Belfast Cumann na Ban from 1917 to 1922. We're also joined by Gráinne Mcneil, who is the interim director of Cultural and Macadam O'Fag, an Irish language, arts and cultural centre on the Falls Road. She has worked in the past as a translator, a primary school teacher, and a producer of online educational material for Irish medium schools. Our final panellist this evening is Linda Irvine. Linda was born into a working class Protestant family in East Belfast. She is the first Irish language officer to be based in a loyalist area. When she began learning Irish in 2011, no one would have conceived of the idea of an Irish language centre in the heart of East Belfast. But despite the many difficulties, the centre is now one of the largest providers of Irish language classes in Belfast. In 2013, Linda received the Roll of Honour and the Aisling Award for her work promoting the Irish language. In 2015, she received the Community Relations Council Civic Leadership Award, and in 2020, she received the East Side Community Champion Award. Prior to her present role as manager of the Tourist Project, she trained as a teacher and taught English in a secondary school in East Belfast. She is presently undertaking a part-time degree in Irish. So all of our panellists are eminent in their field, and we thank them for giving their time to be with us this evening. We're going to go through in broadly chronological order, starting with the Gaelic revival, moving through to the establishment of the West Belfast Gaeltacht, and then looking at more recent developments in the east of the city. So we'll start with Margaret first. Margaret, if I could ask you just to tell us a bit about what the Gaelic revival was and the role women played in that movement.
Thank you, Megan, and good evening, everybody. Great to see so many of you, and I'm thrilled that we're able to talk about women in the North and the Gaelic revival. And I'm going to just give a little bit of history. Obviously, lots was happening in other parts of the country, but a lot was happening in Ulster, and I think quite often we get forgotten about. So I want to talk about particularly women in the Glens of Antrim, but I'll start off with look at, why was a revival needed? And the establishment of the national school system by the British in 1832, it was through the use of English and not Irish. It was a deliberate way of trying to eliminate Irish in Ireland. The famine then came in the 1840s, and with the death of millions of the poorest, who were all native Irish speakers, that really was a waterstone in the decline of the language. And the Irish suffragette Hannah Sheehy Skeffington used the experience of her family to describe how Irish was almost eliminated. She said grandfather was a native Irish speaker and used to tell how he got a stroke of the cane from his teacher at the end of each day for each word of Irish spoken. She said her father knew some Irish and wished to have me taught Irish, but he was told I'd be the only pupil and it wasn't possible to form a class for me alone. So she learnt German and French, and in 1899 as a student, spent a year in Paris as an au pair. But when she came back, she was amazed to find many of her friends enrolled in the Gaelic League, planning to spend their summer holiday in the west of Ireland to learn Irish from native speakers. So the change was really very quick in terms of the enthusiasm of the younger generation. And it really starts with the formation of the Gaelic League in 1893. Douglas Hyde, who was Professor of Irish at the National University, a Protestant from Roscommon, had given a speech in 1892, pointing out in order to de-Anglicise ourselves, we must arrest the decay of the language, and he became president of the League. So in 1899, there were 80 branches, and by 1908, there were 671 throughout Ireland. And what was really revolutionary with the League was that it offered women their first chance of taking an active public role. It was open to both women and men, and it was the first organisation to do this. So although it was mainly middle class in membership, it drew urban and rural together, and it also gave status to the Irish peasantry, who were recognised as custodians of the language, the Irish cultural heritage. And this younger generation gained a new social freedom in being able to go to Irish-speaking weekends and mixed company. And I think that was, to be honest, a large part of the attraction, that girls and boys were able to socialise together. Priests frowned upon dancing, but were much more relaxed where ceilidhs were concerned. Until the period of the Easter Rising, the League remained non-political, but many of the women did move from membership of the League to membership of nationalist organisations. So the first person that I want to talk about is Alice Milligan. She was born in Omagh, one of 13 children, and she came from a middle-class Protestant and Unionist family. In the 1870s, the family moved to Belfast, where her father managed the Bank Buildings department store, which is now Primark. She and her siblings attended Methodist College, and Alice then went to London to study at King's College, and then came to Dublin to train as a teacher. She then taught in schools in Belfast and Derry. But in 1898, she had become a nationalist, and she soon became a very active figure in the Gaelic League. She initiated women's commemorations of the centenary of the United Irish Rising. She founded 3 branches of the Women's Centenary Association around the north of Ireland. With her friend Anna Johnson, they edited the Shan Van Vocht Journal, the Irish for the Poor Old Woman, in Belfast, and they published articles in Irish, plays and fiction. They published the first articles of James Connolly, and that lasted from 1896 to 1899, and it was an all-Ireland paper, and you can find it online. It's all digitized and online if you want to read it. But in 1904, Alice was employed by the Gaelic League as a teacher of Irish, and she's now started to bring Irish into the rural north. She became friends with the women of the Glens of Antrim. She wrote 11 plays, she gave magic lantern slide lectures, and she organised what were called tableaux vivants, or living pictures, where people dressed in costumes to illustrate scenes from Irish history. Catherine Morris has written a great biography of Alice Milligan, and she talks about the significance of these living pictures, how critical they were for people who were at different levels of Irish language learning, and for the inclusion of people whose upbringing led them to believe that Irish wasn't their native language or national culture. So Alice, for example, worked with artist Rosamund Prager from Hollywood, who was a staunch unionist, but Rosamund designed sets for the tableaus. So Catherine Morris says that the silence in the tableaus is a means of creating a space that crossed borders and barriers. And Alice Milligan herself, although such an enthusiastic member of the Gaelic League, never really learnt to speak very good Irish. She really struggled with it. The president, I'm going to move on to the women of the Glens, of the Belfast branch of the Gaelic League was Owen Mcneil from Glenarm. He was a leading Gaelic scholar. He later is much more famous as the man who tried to prevent the Easter Rising. But he remembered Irish being spoken in the Glens during his childhood and wanted to see the language spoken there again. It had been spoken in the Glens and Rathlin Island up until the 1850s, so it was one of the last Gaeltacht areas in Ulster. And so League branches were soon formed in the Glens with ceilidhs, visits to historical places, language classes and concerts. Margaret Dubs, who was one of the most significant figures, she was born in Dublin, but her family had been Antrim landowners since the late 16th century. They were unionists and they had no tradition of learning Irish. Margaret herself heard Gaelic from her Scottish nurse, and she said she then taught herself. The family lived in Dublin with holidays to Glenariff Lodge, but after her father's death, Margaret moved permanently to Antrim, and she soon joined the Glens, which was the name of the Gaelic League group there. Her house at Portnagolan in Cushing was a centre for League activities and a meeting place for her friends. She was a treasurer of the Ulster College in Clockaneely in the Donegal Gaeltacht, which was established in 1906, and she organised a scholarship scheme to send children to the summer school, and she lectured herself there. Then Margaret Dubs, together with Francis Joseph Biggar of Belfast and Sir Roger Casement and another woman, Rose Young, was a founder member of the Feis of the Glens, which was first held in Glenariff in June 1904. And the papers, you can read the papers about this. It seems to have been a really vibrant event. They talked about a procession from Cushing being led by pipers from Armagh with banners representing the 9 glens. Rathlin Island was represented with 200 of the 325 Irish speakers on the island who travelled over on a boat paid for by Roger Casement, accompanied by their own piper. It was all very DIY. Casement was the one who cut the grass down in the fields so that they could put chairs out for people. The competition included music, dancing, history and language. There was a hurling match, and the Feis was unique in having a local industries section, which still remains as its arts and crafts section. It was held annually until the outbreak of the First World War, and Margaret Dubs helped to revive it in 1928, and apparently it still takes place. So if anyone does come from that area, I would be very interested in hearing more about it. Most biographers mention that Margaret contributed towards the defence of Roger Casement when he was tried for treason in 1916, but they assume that was because of their friendship only. In fact, Margaret Dubs was a member of the first executive of Cumann na mBan in 1914, so she obviously had nationalist sympathies. Rose Young lived for many years with her in her house and in fact died there. Rose was born in Galgorm Castle, another very upmarket, salubrious place. Her father, John Young, was a founder and managing director of the Braidwater Spinning Company and a director of Northern Counties Railway and a very strong unionist. Rose briefly became a governess in England and joined the Gaelic League in London before she returned to Galgorm. And she has a diary which has been published by people in Galgorm. She talks about the next year when after she had come back to Galgorm. She says that Miss Aidan Mcneil came to read Irish with me. In July, she attended the first Glens Feis with her brother and sister. In 1905, she went to Dublin and lunched with Douglas Hyde. In 1906, she went to Belfast to see an Irish play at St. Mary's Hall. And the following July, she said she walked up the Glens with Brian O'Byrne to see W. McShane, Rose McGrogan and Biddy McVeigh to talk Irish. So she was moving between life in the big house and the cottages of the peasantry, and recognising the only way she could really learn Irish was to befriend the local peasantry. But she did mix between the two. So, for example, in June 1911, there was a great party at Galgorm for the coronation of George V. But a few days later, she was at a feis at Garan Tower, and so it continued to the end. In 1935, she records the Royal Jubilee celebrations with bonfires on the Antrim coast, and in 1938, the inauguration of her old friend Douglas Hyde as President of Ireland. She edited volumes of old Irish poetry and did much to revive Irish culture. Although her brother was a Unionist MP, it seems she never fell out with the family, and she's buried in the family plot at Ohoho. Another woman was Margaret Mcdonald from Cushing. She was a descendant of the Mcdonalds of Antrim, and her interest was particularly in the improvement of the living standards of local people. With her friend Miss Sturge, she established a toy factory in Cushing in 1901, provided employment and encouraged traditional wood skills. And some of the work is seen in the National Museum in Dublin, including a Georgian-style doll's house. The last woman, Aidan Mcneil, who was referred to by Margaret Dubs, was born in England, but she was brought up in Cushing, and she was known throughout the Glens as Miss Ada. She was the first cousin of Ronald Mcneil, who was Lord Cushing, a staunch unionist. Ada was an early member of the Gaelic League and another lifelong friend of Roger Casement. She also visited him in Brixton Jail in 1916 before his execution. And throughout her life, she worked for the promotion of the Irish language and the folklore of the Glens. Miss Ada died in 1959 and is buried in the Church of Ireland graveyard in Cushing. So that's all I have to say now. It's a very quick run through of some of the women who were very active. And it's important, I think, to remember that the Glens of Antrim were one of the leading areas in the Irish revival. I think sometimes forgotten as the focus tends to be on the west of Ireland, but I think Ulster has its own proud tradition and women were really at the heart of it.
Thanks very much, Margaret. That was a really interesting run through. And, you know, the names of pretty much all of those women I had never heard before tonight. And we're actually, you know, right in the middle of the decade of centenaries at the moment. And I was wondering what work has been done to try and put women back into history, and what has the response to this work sort of been? Because so many of those names are just unknown despite the contribution that they played.
I think that there's been quite a lot of work really, and since particularly, well, 2014 was the centenary of Cumann and that it was a lot of recovery work done then, a lot more publications. I think in terms of nationalist women, there's been a lot of archival material released in the last decade as part of the Irish government's contribution. So you can, if you, for example, looked at the Bureau of Military History witness statements. Now, you don't get many women from the north in that, it's very Dublin-centric. But what you do get is so many women talking about their involvement in the Gaelic League and how that starts off. And it seems to be quite often whole families who get involved, or there's girls with their brothers, etc. And it's a real leaping off point for other work. Also, some newspapers being digitized means that we can sort of start to excavate there as well. So there is work being done. There's a lot more work being done now on commemoration and what commemoration means, and also on memory retrieval and how we remember, or do we disremember, you know, because sometimes it can, we might have difficult conversations. We might want to say, for example, look at the Gaelic revival, but maybe feel uncomfortable if it's not just a cultural event, but it also has led people on to being, for example, active Republicans. So there's lots of conversations that are kind of linked with that discovery and recovery of history.
Well, thanks very much. That has been very interesting. If anyone has any questions, just pop them into the chat. We're going to get to those at the end. Grania, I'm going to put you in the spotlight now and ask if you could just kind of outline for us the development of the language network in West Belfast, the different groups that are operating there, and the role women played in establishing this language community.
Thanks very much, Megan, for Margaret. I suppose there have always been groups in Belfast, groups of Irish language speakers. The Common Clonard, which is based in Hawthorne Street, set up in the 30s. And there were groups of friends and scholars, and around about the 1960s, a group of, some of them were siblings, cousins, friends who gathered in the Clonard, had a very radical approach. They were young, they were in their late teens, early 20s, and were starting to marry and bring children into the world, and they decided that they wanted to create a Gaeltacht in Belfast. So a group of them got together and bought 2 acres of land on the Shaws Road. At the time, this is the late 60s, at the time this is like a country area, rural area, but of course by now it's a very urbanized area. So that they bought this land, they built houses and started bringing children into the world. And the idea was that they would have, their children would be able to go out onto the street and play with other children who were speaking Irish. And when it came to school age, these families set up their own schools. And just every step along the way, they set things up themselves, they established things themselves that weren't already there, and very much created their own opportunities to use Irish in everyday life. So although there, you can go back to the start of the last century and there are certain developments along the way, really it was this group, late 60s, early 70s, and the building of the 15 houses in the Shaws Road that is kind of in some way a seed for a lot of what we see today in Irish language circles, or particularly the network in West Belfast. So I work in Culterland Mcdonald, which is old Broadway church on the Falls Road, and within that area there's other Irish language organisations or institutions that promote the language. Culterland is an arts and cultural centre, and we run events such as concerts, dramas. Our resident theatre company had a play about Alice Milligan a few years ago. We have literary events, visual arts exhibitions, and we have youth provision as well, teaching children music, drama, art through the medium of Irish. Our neighbours include schools in Ivy and Unad Ivahach, which has it's a wonderful place for early years provision in particular. We have an arm's length body, Corley na Gael Scoileachta, that promotes Irish medium education. They're based in the new Aras Nawal building that opened just last year, barely opened before it had to close again. There's a business development group in there, and Conor na Gaelic, the Irish language advocacy group, is based in Aras Nawal. Across the road is St Mary's Training College, and about 21 years ago, when I was doing my teacher training, I did a postgraduate certificate in education, and I was able to do that through the medium of Irish. So this is something that kind of came out of the schools that were set up. The first Irish medium primary school, Bunscoil Phobal Firsta, was set up in 1971 with 9 pupils. Today there are around 80 different schools in the north, and whenever you set up a school, like people, you look back over history, people fight tooth and nail to keep schools open because they're such important hubs for any community. And so much development has come out of the school. When you have children, they need textbooks. So you need people to write the textbooks, print them, illustrate them. When the children want to go on a school trip, is there someone in the zoo that can speak Irish to them? There's youth clubs. After school provision is really important, and that's something I'd like to talk about in a minute, is the importance of the youth provision, and particularly the role of young people in the current campaign for an Irish Language Act. So as these children, the original 9 in who were in the first Bunscoil on the Shaws Road, as they approached secondary level, they needed a secondary school. Now, some of these families were so radical that they sent their children to Dublin to school. But eventually they managed to, well, they set up a secondary school that was around for a couple of years, and then it just got too difficult to keep it going. But by 1991, the impetus was still very strong to have a second level school. And around that time, Old Broadway Church became available. So a group of Irish language activists got together, put in an application, and were given the Culturland as it is today to take it over. So it was originally got to set up a school in it. And after 4 or 5 years, the school got too big and had to move up to another site in Beechmount. But because that building was so big, there were two nursery schools moved in, a bookshop, a newspaper. There was an art gallery, a theatre, a cafe. In the early years, there was also a pirate radio station that now has its own purpose-built 4-story building just at the bottom of the falls there. It developed into Radio Fáilte. Féile and Phobal, the biggest community festival in Europe, started off in the Culturland. And also various artists, individual artists and designers had workshops in the Culturland. So I mentioned there about the importance of the youth. There's like so many groups in West Belfast in different parts of that area. So for example, on the White Rock Road, there's a school, Bunskull and Chlevagiv, and there's Glór na Móna. And Glór na Móna is a very innovative and groundbreaking organisation because they provide out of school youth activities. They're professionalised. The people who work with them have degrees in youth work. And this is something, I was on the committee of a youth group in the south, and as far as I remember, there's no provision like that. There's no third level provision, to professionalise as a youth worker. So, where there are young people, they have needs, especially children who have additional educational needs, things like speech and language therapy, children with autism, they need extra services. And if they're speaking Irish at home and if they're speaking Irish in school, and really these are the kind of services that should be provided in Irish. And this is all part of the campaign towards having the state recognise that and provide those services. In terms of women and the role of women, a lot of the figureheads and the well-known characters who were involved in the development of the Gaeltacht in Belfast are men. But a lot of the work that's unspoken about really doesn't get as much airtime, or it's not as glamorous. It's the work that's done in classrooms. It's the work that's done at home. So back in the early days in particular, when schools were being set up, teachers were mostly women, and they were not only teaching, they were having to write books themselves. They were having to develop resources, and often they were not being paid for this. So just before I came on here earlier today, I phoned a friend of mine who grew up in the Shaws Road Gaeltacht and asked about her mother. It's like, why are people talking about your father and your uncle, but not so much your mother? What is it? And her take on it was that it's personality. Her mother and her aunt and some of the other women involved in this, a lot of them are by nature quiet, self-effacing, humble people who don't want to be in the limelight. But she made an excellent point that this doesn't mean that they're any less passionate, and passion doesn't mean being loud and out there. So I think it's the passion that can be done in so many ways and expressed in so many ways that has driven the revival, this contemporary revival, and women have had a huge role. They're the ones in the classrooms, training children in their formative years and sending them out into the world to do all this other work that we see around us.
Thanks very much, Grania. That was really interesting. I could clip through a sort of potted history of the West Belfast Gaeltacht. It was really interesting to hear about how it was the schools that kind of brought Irish back to life, especially after what Margaret was saying about the establishment of the English-speaking national school system sort of being a means of erasing Irish. So kind of beginning to come full circle there by sort of putting it back in. So that was really interesting, thank you. I was just wondering if I could ask you a wee bit more about Cultureland, which is of course celebrating its 30th birthday this year. So many congratulations to you for that. Over the decades, it's become a major landscape in the Irish language community and in the city generally. And just in light of what we've been talking about there, of women's contributions being more unspoken than men, I was wondering if you could comment on the fact that there are 3 people commemorated by the Cultureland building and they're all men.
Yeah, so Cultureland is named after Cardinal Thomas O'Fee and Robert Shipboy McAdam. So the founders of the Cultureland had a history group in the late 80s, early 90s, and they were on a trip to Iona, and on the boat they met Cardinal O'Fee, and he was a great Irish language and literature scholar, and he died quite suddenly around, I think maybe around about a year before the Cultureland was set up. So he was very much in the consciousness of the founders of the Cultureland. And Robert Shipboy McAdam was a Presbyterian entrepreneur who had iron foundries and other businesses around the bottom of the falls. So they had this a cross-community element. I think that the symbolism of that is really important. Yeah, and then the third man is Jared Dillon. So the gallery on the ground floor of the Cultureland, the extension to the building that was built 10 years ago, is named after Jared Dillon, who is an artist from Clonard area. So yeah, I'm not sure, was it ever thought about, did it even register the fact that here are 3 men? But the theatre, this is a lesser known fact, and it's something that we will have to shout out a bit more about, is the fact that the Arkland, the theatre, is named after Siobhan McKinney, an actress. So there's 1 woman there, but there's definitely some evening up to be done. I'd like to mention just our current programme. The first quarter of the year, from January to March, has a very feminine kind of emphasis, just the way things fall. In January, there was Nullag na Man, Women's Christmas. 1st of February was Imbolg and Bridge, Féile Bríde, St. Bridget's Day. And in March, we have International Women's Day. So we've had a lot of events celebrating women for International Women's Day. We have 3 interviews going out on the week starting the 8th of March with 3 different women who have been involved with the Cultureland and who practice arts. We've a visual artist, an actress, an actor, and a musician. So, and most of our staff are women. So I feel like that there's more, just more awareness about the contribution that women have made, and I expect that in years to come that this will be celebrated in different ways, and the symbolism of naming spaces after women, for example.
Thanks very much, Grania. That was a really interesting answer, and I'm looking forward to some of those events to mark Cultureland's 30th year. We'll go to our final panelist now, Linda. I was wondering if you could outline for us the work that's been happening with language in East Belfast.
Okay, thank you. It's lovely to see everybody. When I thought about, this about the sort of influence of women, one of the things that struck me that I'd never thought about before was the project Turas, the Irish language project that I run in East Belfast, was actually born out of a women's group, because I was part of a cross-community women's group in East Belfast. It was women from the Short Strand and women from the Newtownards Road. And we did a 6-week taster in Irish back in 2011, early 2011, so 10 years ago. And that's what started it, basically. Hitchme and Lesh and Changa, I fell in love with the language. Always think what was interesting at the time was my friends from the Short Strand, women from the Short Strand, had no interest whatsoever in the Irish language, and they were much more interested in the royal wedding that was just about to happen and what Kate's dress would look like. So there you go, strange times. But I ended up going to Andrehead over in the Armour Road and started learning Irish, and that would have been the end of the story, only my husband at the time happened to be the leader of the Progressive Unionist Party, so it ended up in a few newspapers. I gave an interview, mentioned East Belfast Mission, and it just took off from there. There was local interest, so we started classes. Now, at that time, I knew nothing about language revival, language rights, nothing. I was learning a couple of focal and having great fun. And because I loved the language, I wanted to give other people the opportunity to get involved with it. One of the things that struck me was the fact that other people felt the same locally, who came and said, oh, I'd love to learn. I want to learn. Can I join you? Can I come along? There were other people who thought it was really strange. I may as well have said, I was getting involved in space travel. And then there was a minority who were extremely hostile, And my husband and I joke about it now, because the attitude was, Bram, you want to keep her in the house. And, he'll always say, tie her up 3 times, but after she gnawed through the ropes, well, we just give it up as a bad job, That is a joke. So, but there was some real nastiness, and I think that was one of the things that really made me sort of sit up and take notice. And, maybe women, we have our own sort of quiet determination. So the more people told me that I wasn't going to do this, well, the more determined I was going to do it, and nobody was going to stop me doing it. And other people, as I say, they came along, they got involved, and the classes grew really quickly. At the beginning, strangely enough, they were mostly men. I don't know what it is about language classes seem to attract men, they feel safe. Now I'd say it's a lot more even. There's a lot of women involved with us. But one of the things that happened that I suppose, well, I think at the beginning I got away. Some people tell me I got away with it, let's put it that way. When we started, actually set up Turas, and Turas means journey. It was in 2012 by the time we got funding, and I took the job as development officer. That was in September. I think it was October or November, I think it was November that year, the flag protest started. And East Belfast, and the part of East Belfast where we're based, was probably one of the worst affected areas. And I remember just thinking, oh my goodness, this probably maybe wasn't a good time. But I have to say now, we were largely ignored. But there was some unpleasantness. I suppose we were viewed with suspicion, and it also, a lot of my learners were quite frightened. They didn't want people knowing they were learning Irish. They were, they kept it very quiet. And I remember one night in particular, we had a bit of an event talking about, Protestants and the Irish language, and 3 of the flag protesters turned up. And we hadn't realised there'd been a meeting that day about which of them would come along to this event we were running, and they were the ones that came. That was very obvious on the night that they were extremely hostile to what we were doing, extremely hostile to our message. But what was interesting was when they met other people that were there, as the talk opened up, as we talked about, the different work, it started to calm down, and things came out like, well, why did this only start after the flag came down? And we said, well, it didn't. It started before that. We've been doing this for a year, and oh right, well, what about this? And we said, well, that isn't true either. And by the time actually that particular meeting was over, 2 of them were very much on our side. One of them wasn't. One of them we didn't win over, I have to say, but two of them we did. So, you know, and I think that's how the journey has been for us. You know, a lot of people who maybe start off hostile, who have talked about organising protests, who have attacked us on social media, have ended up becoming volunteers, friends and learners, you know. So that is a really positive thing. And, you know, and I suppose it's taught me as well, because, you know, I do a lot of stuff on social media. And, you know, I'd never been on social media before I got this job. And I was quite shocked at, you know, how hostile people could be towards you and how rude, you know. And I remember showing my husband, you know, sort of the first kind of nasty messages. And he said, oh, don't take it personally, you know. I says, well, it's about me, like it is personal. I feel like, and he's, Linda, toughen up. You know, and he was right, you know, that you did have to toughen up, and I had to accept that, you know, not everybody felt the way I did. But I also learned very early that if I treated people as badly as they treated me, then I would never win them over. And I also realized too that quite often, you know, somebody's debating with you and they're being very insulting, and you're never going to persuade them. But there's another lot of people looking in, and they may not say anything, but they can see, and people know what's right and people know what's fair. And I have had loads of messages over the years. People have privately sent me messages to say, you know, I'm not interested in the Irish language, or I don't like the Irish language, or I'm not sure about what you do, but I don't think that's right the way you're being spoken to. And you've been quite, you know, you've been quite polite there, and, you know, and maybe I'll come down and we'll have a chat or something, you know. So I think that's really, really important. And I've learned to kind of use social media in that way, and not sort of get into rows. I think one of the biggest issues I had was around the Irish Language Act, because when I first started learning Irish, I had no interest in language legislation. I didn't understand what language legislation was, but I very quickly started to realise how important it is to a minority language. And I saw the good work in Scotland and in Wales. So I decided that I would speak out, and my husband said, no, shut your mouth, we're not going to have any windows. And I said, well, no, I can't do that, Brian. I can't believe something and not say it publicly. So I was on the Spotlight programme, and I knew that this was a real sort of watershed, that, you know, the Spotlight programme was a programme that's watched by a lot of people within the Loyalist community. And that if I came out and showed support for the Irish Language Act, that it could put myself in jeopardy, it could put the project in jeopardy, I could lose learners. But I felt that it was the right thing to do, and I did. And, you know, it was fine. It was absolutely fine. I know some of my learners maybe weren't happy about it, but we were able to talk about it. And it did harden hearts towards me. It created some more hostility towards me. But there you go. I get on and I do what I do. And as I was saying earlier, in some ways, I think being a woman has been a really useful thing, because in many ways you were viewed as, oh, well, it's just that wee woman, you know, it's just a bit harmless, just never listen to her, you know. And so you did get away with things that maybe men wouldn't have. You weren't, you know, you weren't viewed in the same way. So I get threats on social media by faceless, nameless people, you know, and I just kind of think, well, if they don't even have the courage to show their own face or their own name, you know, not really something to be frightened of. And also some of these faceless, nameless people, I've managed to get them on board over the years, and now they're good friends, and they come into ours and have a cup of tea, and they're not scary at all, you know, so there you go. So what do we do? Well, we started off with one class. We now have, I say even online now, we've got about 12 or 13 classes a week of all levels and ability. We started off all people in Bunrang and beginners. I'm very proud to say now we have people right up the Irvine advanced level. We run our own GCSE class, and we send people out to do A-level. In other places, we don't offer A-level yet. We also send people out to university, and because they were getting the language and getting on board with the language, we set up a scholarship scheme. So 8 of our learners are now at university, 5 doing degrees in Irish and 3 doing diplomas in Irish, and we help them then to pay their fees. Also, one of my learners who came he had educated all his children, sent them all to university, but he had no education himself, but always wanted to go to university. And because he says, because of coming to Turris and starting to learn Irish, he had a great passion for history and politics. So he applied to Queen's, even though he didn't have the qualifications. And I was one of the people who wrote a letter of reference for him. Queen's accepted him without the qualifications, and he got a first in his degree. He did a master's, and he's now doing a PhD. So a lot of success stories in Turris. The big news at the minute is we are hoping in September to open an integrated Irish medium nursery school in East Belfast, the first of its kind. So that's a lot of mothers, a lot of women, and so there's a lot of work going on, and I'm very, very proud, and I'll always be proud to be associated with Turris. And just, you know, I always say people coming together, sitting down together, learning together and laughing together. It seems a strange thing to attack, but there you go.
Linda, thank you so much. That has been a real journey to go from just one women's group 10 years ago to now there's 8 people at university. There's plans for a preschool. That has been an amazing journey. So very, very well done. And it hasn't been easy at times, very definitely.